We're looking at the end of the Buddha's life. The Buddha spent his life in the northern part of India, wandering around what's referred to as the Ganges Valley in India. It's quite a wide area. When he was born, when he gained enlightenment at the age of 29, that part of India consisted of a number of small kingdoms and republics. Although through his life there was increasing centralization based on cities. There was a lot of vying for power. Indeed, in the early years after his enlightenment, the Buddha managed to help avert a war. There was a dispute between two clans of the Shakyan group, which is the overall group that the Buddha came from. So between the Gautamas and the Kolyas, which are basically his father's side and his mother's side. And there was a dispute over water. There wasn't much water, and each side wanted to take the river's water and not let the other side have it. So the Buddha managed to get there in time and put it to them, which is more valuable, water or a warrior, a human being? And they fortunately saw sense, and the war was averted. So, coming to near the end of the Buddha's life, there's a whole sutta which describes in quite a bit of detail the last part of the Buddha's life. And it begins in a place called Rajagaha, which is the capital or the seat of one of the kings of that time, King Ajatasattu. Now, King Ajatasattu had killed his father. He'd killed his father, King Bimbisara, to gain the throne. And Bimbisara was an early friend and supporter of the Buddha. Although actually Ajatasattu was also a supporter of the Buddha, despite his behaviour. And what we learn early on in this sutta is that King Ajatasattu sends one of his ministers called Vasikara, and he wants to get advice from the Buddha. He wants to get advice because he wants to engage in battle or attack a neighbouring confederacy, the Vijayana Confederacy. So Ajatasattu knows the Buddha will never lie, so he sends his minister to ask him, what's the chance of me winning this battle, sort of thing. So the Buddha doesn't respond directly, but he asks his companion Ananda, who we heard about earlier on, he asks them about various conditions that promote stability in a society. So, for example, he says, well, do the Vijayans meet regularly and frequently in assemblies? Do they get together? Do they meet and do they break up in harmony? In other words, is there harmony in their assemblies? And Ananda affirms that this is how they do behave, this is how they do conduct their business. And so the Buddha says, well, in that case, you can expect the Vijayans to prosper and not to decline. And the Buddha then goes on to tell this minister of Ajatasattu, Vasikara, that he taught the Vijayans these principles. So the minister, his response is, yes, you're right. The Vijayans won't be defeated by force of arms, only by propaganda. And what he realizes is that he needs to create internal dissension if they're to be successful in their war. And indeed, sometime after that, Ajatasattu begins a rather long war in which the Confederacy is finally defeated and the land's annexed some 15 years after the Buddha's death. So this is the sort of background of what's going on. The Buddha at this point decides to go on a final tour. He wants to meet as many of his disciples as possible, give final teachings to his disciples. And he comes to a place called Pataligama, which is now the site of the modern city Patna, and discovers that Ajatasattu's ministers are building a fortress there. And it says that the Buddha sees thousands of devas, godlike figures, spirits, if you like, taking up residence where they're about to build this city. And he predicts it will become a chief city, although it will suffer from various perils, from fire, flood, and internal dissension. So Pataligama is on the Ganges, so it's on the big river, and whereas Rajagaha, the original capital of Ajatasattu, is kind of in a sort of hill area. It's got a sort of hill protection. But what Ajatasattu realizes is that this is a better strategic position to, in other words, have control of the river. And this Pataligama becomes the capital of his kingdom of Magadha, which in time becomes the capital of the Mauryan Empire, which covers most of India under the Emperor Chandragupta, whose son is the famous Emperor Ashoka, who converted to Buddhism and was very key in the spread of Buddhism more widely through India. So the Buddha's prediction that this place will become a big city comes true, as indeed apparently do the various perils that I mentioned. So, as I said early on, I mentioned this, there was this conflict where the Buddha did manage to avert a war, but as I've just indicated, in this latter case, with King Ajatasattu, he didn't manage to avert a war. Indeed, he didn't manage to stop his own tribe, his own group, the Shakshans, from being massacred, which happened. We're not quite sure whether it was just before or just after the death of the Buddha. Also, around this time, he heard that King Pasenadi, who was the same age of the Buddha, King Pasenadi of Kosala, had been deposed by his son, and he died a pauper outside the gates of Rajagaha. Later, Kosala itself was defeated and absorbed into Magadha. So now you might be wondering why I'm telling you all about this, this rather disturbing history. So I want to do, in a way, just paint a picture of what was going on around the time, particularly the time of the death of the Buddha. It was clearly a very unstable world. That's in a way nothing new in history, but around the time, it wasn't like it was all super peaceful. It was a very unstable world. And the Buddha's aim, the Buddha is not aiming to, if you like, achieve worldly peace. In a way, the Buddha recognized that this is the way of the world. This is the way of how unenlightened beings behave. What the Buddha's aim was something that went beyond that, a transcendental goal, offering individual liberation, as I said, beyond the world. So I thought it's worth, in a way, being a bit clear about that. It's sort of worth reflecting on, what is our aim for practicing the Dharma? I'm based at the LBC, the London Buddhist Centre, and for a while I was chair there. And sometimes people would say to me, what are we doing about lonely old people who live in the neighbourhood? Or more recently, people more like to say, what is the London Buddhist Centre doing about, for example, climate change? Now, it's not that those are bad things. I'm not saying they're bad things to try and do something about the changing climate to help old people. But it's not the primary aim of Buddhism. It's not the primary aim of the Dharma. And I think it's worth distinguishing between our sphere of concern and our sphere of influence. So in other words, we may be concerned about things, going on around the world, but we may not be able to directly intervene to make a change there. I have some friends, for example, who work in government who may be able to do something like that, and in a way that the more Buddhists that work in government, in a way, well, the better. But it's, as I say, it's not the direct aim. And again, I think it's worth remembering that, because whilst it's good to be concerned about the wider things, the counterside is that we can sometimes get obsessed, for example, with news feeds, or even, dare I say, obsessed with less salubrious feeds that may come onto our mobile device. Bodhipatra, in his book on the Brahma Viharas, quotes Rolf de Belly, who says this about news. He says, "News is toxic to your body. It constantly triggers the limbic system. Panicky stories spur the release of cascades of glucocorticoid. This deregulates your immune system and inhibits the release of growth hormones. In other words, your body finds itself in a state of chronic stress. High glucocorticoid levels cause impaired digestion, lack of growth of the cells, the hair and the bones, nervousness and susceptibility to infections. The other potential side effects include fear, aggression, tunnel vision, and desensitization." So, in a way, it's pointing to, we need to be careful with what we allow in, what we put into our body. That's a basic aspect of Buddhist practice, mindfulness, so-called guarding the gates of the senses, because what we allow in is going to affect us, and we want to have things that affect us in a beneficial way, not in an adverse way. So yes, it's important to remember that the primary aim, if we're serious about practicing the Dharma, is the liberation of the mind and heart, and helping others to do the same. And if we recollect the Buddha's Parinirvana, that can help us, that can be supportive in reminding us of our focus, reminding us of what the Buddha was really about. So the Buddha, he proceeds in various stages from Pataligama. He then goes to Vesali, and at Vesali he stays in the grove of Ambapali. So Ambapali is apparently a very beautiful courtesan, and she comes to visit the Buddha. The Buddha teaches her, and then she invites the Buddha and his companions, the monks who are with him, for a meal the following day. And she goes home then to arrange that. On the way home, she bumps, it says axle to axle, presumably in some kind of chariot, with some ewes, a lich of ewes. The literary views seem to be very matchy-matchy in terms of their outfits. So they were either in red, blue, yellow or white, and they had matching clothes, makeup and adornments, apparently. So this is how they were dressed. Anyway, when they hear that Ambalapali is going to have the Buddha for a meal the next day, they say, "Oh, give up that meal. I'll give you 100,000 pieces. So I'll give you a whole load of money if you'll give up that meal." And she says, "Not for all the wealth in Vaisali will I do that." And then they snap their fingers and they say, "We've been beaten by the mango woman. We've been cheated by the mango woman." She's called the mango woman because Ambapali literally means mango guardian. Pali is guardian. It was said she was found as an abandoned child under a mango tree, and that's how she gets her name. So, nevertheless, they go on to the youths go on to see the Buddha. The Buddha, maybe with a little smile, says to his disciples, "If you've never seen the gods of the 33, well, just have a look over these literary roofs, because they kind of look like that." So, anyway, they then arrive, the youths arrive, and the Buddha teaches them, and the youths try and get in there and say, "How about coming for a meal tomorrow?" And the Buddha says, "No, I've already agreed to have a meal with Ambalapali." So again, they snap their fingers and say, "We've been beaten by the mango woman. We've been cheated by the mango woman." So the following day, Ambapali gives a meal, and she then very kindly gives her park to the Buddha and his disciples for their use. And the Buddha teaches her. It says, instructed, inspired, fired, and delighted her with a talk on the Dharma. And quite a bit later on, she goes forth and becomes a nun. We'll hear about her a bit later. So this is just one of the examples of the sort of interactions that go on in this sort of final tour, meeting people, teaching. He meets householders, he meets disciples who've gone forth, despite the fact that by this time he's very weary. It's said, he described his body as just as an old cart is made to go by being held together with straps. And the only time that he's free from pain is when he's in deep meditation. So as I said, each place he teaches, often the fundamental teachings of the Dharma, like the Threefold Way, the Noble Eightfold Path. So he's preparing his disciples for his death, reminding them of the basic principles of the Dharma, and referring either directly or indirectly to his impending death. So, for example, he says that his disciples should live as an island. They should live as an island. He says to Ananda, "You should live as islands unto yourselves, being your own refuge, with no one else as your refuge, with the Dharma as an island, with the Dharma as your refuge, with no other refuge." Bhante, that Sanghraj who founded our tradition, points out that there's sort of a bit of a contradiction here, in the sense that he's saying, make yourself a refuge, but also make the Dharma a refuge. And what he suggests is it's almost like there's a subjective and an objective aspect to that. So there's a subjective aspect or subjective refuge in terms of going for refuge to one's own spiritual development. But then there's also an objective refuge, which is a spiritual life as devotion to the supremely worthwhile object of the Dharma. So this moment when the the Buddha said this to Ananda was after the Buddha had been a bit sick. And when this happened, Ananda said that, "Lord, my body was like a drunkard's. I lost my bearings and things were unclear to me because of the Lord's sickness." So Ananda, who knew the Buddha was going to die, nevertheless he was very, very thrown by the impending death. And it's a bit like the Buddha was saying, well, look, I have laid out all the teachings. You know what to do. You've just got to do it. In a way, now it's up to you. So what the Buddha is saying there is that we have to take full responsibility for our spiritual lives in the context of devotion to the Dharma. So, for example, one of the lines in the Dhammapada is, "By you must a zealous effort be made. The Tathagatas, that is the Buddhas, are only proclaimers of the way." So the Buddhas can teach us, but we have to do the work. We have to work on our minds. We have to transform our minds, and that means we have to be completely responsible for our minds. So we of course, we can make the full use of whatever conditions can support us. The Sangha, the Brixton community, but we have to do the work with our mind and not fall into blame when things are not how we like, when other people, the world, is not how we like it, if it doesn't suit us. Because when we fall into blame, we just fall into, well, we lose the initiative over our lives. We lose the reins of our lives. Rather than taking charge of our lives, we fall into a victim mentality. So what the Buddha is pointing to is a radical kind of responsibility where we just work all the time on our minds to transform them. So round about this time, at a place called the Kapala Shrine, Mara appears to the Buddha. So Mara, well, there's four ways of thinking about Mara. We can think of Mara as being unskillful mind states, whether within or outside. We can think of it, secondly, as clinging to our body or mind as a sense of self, a fixed self. We can think of it, thirdly, as Mara, as death or impermanence, and particularly the fear of death or impermanence. And finally, as the son of a god, Devaputra Mara, which is sort of like an evil or mischievous spirit. So Mara, from before the Buddha's enlightenment, right the way through his life, from time to time, Mara would show up. And each time he shows up, the Buddha goes, "Yeah, I know you, it's Mara," and he sort of slinks away. So it's kind of like a trickster figure that's trying to trick us. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being tricked by your rationalizations into doing something that probably wasn't completely advisable. Anyway, if you've ever had that experience, that's Mara. So this time Mara turns up and says, "Hey, come on, Buddha, it's time for your Parinirvana." In other words, it's time for you to die. It's time for you to clear off. Mara wants the Buddha off the scene because the trouble with Mara is he keeps teaching people how to go beyond craving and hatred, which is Mara's domain. Mara is, if you like, the ruler over unskillful mind states, and the Buddha, unfortunately, helps people to leave those behind from Mara's point of view. Unfortunately, from Mara's point of view, not from our point of view. So he wants the Buddha off, and they think, it's time now, time to clear it off. And he reminds the Buddha that the Buddha said, when he gained enlightenment, that once he'd successfully communicated the Dharma and created a Sangha, then he would enter Parinirvana. He would die. And the Buddha says, "Don't worry, Mara. in 3 months from now, I will enter final Nibbana. I will enter Parinirvana. And at this point, he relinquishes his life force. It says, mindfully and in full awareness, he renounced the life principle. And at this point, there is a great earthquake. It's said to be terrible, hair-raising, and accompanied by thunder. So in other words, something of real significance has just happened. So with that earthquake, we're starting to get a sense that, well, something very important is happening. The Buddha and Ananda continue travelling. He comes to a place called Pava, where he stays in the mango grove of Chunda the smith, and Chunda goes to see the Buddha. The Buddha teaches him, and then Chunda invites him for a meal with Ananda and his other companions. And he makes a very elaborate meal. It's said to be a very fine meal, including something called pig's delight. Now, scholars have spent many years debating what pig's delight actually is, but the fact is we don't know. We don't know if it is some fancy pork dish, or if it, for example, is truffles that pigs delight in eating. The vegetarians like to think it's the latter, but who knows? But what the Buddha says is, only give me the pig's delight and bury the rest of it. And again, with probably a little bit of a sense of humour, he sort of says, I can't see anybody else in the world with its Maras and Devas and Brahmas who could possibly digest this pig's delight except for a Buddha. Which is a polite way of saying that it seems the Buddha recognised that anybody else eating it would get ill. And indeed, the Buddha gets ill after eating this, and he comes down with dysentery, which is his final illness. So he goes from there to Kusinara. On the way, he asks Ananda for some water. And Ananda says, well, look, there's been all this traffic, various whatever carts going by, and it's all churned up the water, so it's really not suitable for drinking. But if we get, there's a bit further on, we'll come to a river and you can have some nice water from there. And the Buddha says, no, get me some water now. And they do that 3 times, because that's always what happens in Buddhist stories. You have to do it 3 times. And then Ananda goes, and amazingly the water's completely clear. So he gives the Buddha some water, and then somebody called Pakusa shows up, and Pakusa's got a question for the Buddha. I won't go into what the question was, but the Buddha teaches him, and Pakusa becomes a disciple of the Buddha. And not only that, he gives the Buddha and Ananda, he gives the Buddha 2 golden robes, so one for the Buddha, one for Ananda. And Ananda comments that the Buddha's skin is even brighter than this gold cloth. And he's somewhat amazed by this. And the Buddha says, yes, so the Buddha's skin is very bright when a Buddha gains enlightenment or when a Buddha gains Parinirvana. Parinirvana literally means Nibbana without remainder. It's without the remainder being the body. So it's in Nibbana, so you have enlightenment's Nibbana, and then you got Nibbana but letting go of the body. So on these 2 occasions. And he also says to Ananda, just in case Chunda should feel remorse, remember Chunda's the one who's just given him the pig's delight, which has given him his final illness. He says, reassure Chunda that there are two particularly auspicious meals that you can give to a Buddha. The one is the one immediately before he gains enlightenment, and the other one immediately before he gains Parinirvana. And so this is the last meal the Buddha had before his Parinirvana. So he thoughtfully had that in mind so that Chunda wouldn't suffer. He then goes to a sal grove just outside Kusinara, lies down on a couch, and as we heard earlier, the sal trees bloom untimely. They come into bloom and the flowers rain down. It says, and those twin sal trees burst forth into an abundance of untimely blossoms, which fell upon the Tathagata's body, sprinkling it and covering it in homage. Divine coral tree flowers fell from the sky, divine sandalwood powder fell from the sky, sprinkling and covering the Tathagata's body in homage. Divine music and song sounded from the sky in homage of the Tathagata. Also at this time, so there's all this going on. He's being worshipped by nature, you could say. He asks Upavana, who's one of his faithful disciples, to stop fanning him and move away. And Anand's a bit surprised about this, why he wants this. And so the Buddha explains, says, there are loads and loads of devas, spirits or gods, who've come to see the Buddha's Parinirvana, and they're grumbling because some of them can't see because this monk's standing in the way. So you have to get out of the way. Ananda at this point says to the Buddha, please don't die here. It's like a real miserable little town. Let's go to like a big city. And the Buddha says, don't think of it in this way. This once was a great city. So perhaps the Buddha is saying, don't be rude, Ananda. I'm sure the people of Kusinara like their town. But also he's pointing to the growth and decline of worldly things. That things appear, grow, a great city grows, and then it dissolves. So in other words, he's pointing to impermanence. And perhaps he also wanted to pick a quieter place for his death. That's also a possibility. So the final evening, he asks Ananda to invite the local townspeople. So they're grief-struck, but they go and they pay their respects. The Buddha teaches a final disciple, Subhadda. So right up to the end of his life, he's continuing to teach. He then checks with all his assembled disciples to see if there's any clarification of the teaching, but there isn't. And then he gives his final words, which are, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay, strive on untiringly. Or also translated as, all conditioned things are impermanent, with mindfulness strive on. And then he enters into deep concentration. He enters so deeply that at one point Ananda thinks he's died, but Anuruddha, who is able to read mind, says, no, he's not died yet. And then a bit later, indeed, he does pass into Parinirvana. And then there is another great earthquake, and Brahma Sahumpati, aka Maitrinara, who we heard about earlier, says, all beings in the world, all bodies must break up. Even the teacher, peerless in the human world, the mighty Lord and perfect Buddhas passed away. And Sakka, who is ruler of the Devas, says, impermanent are compounded things, prone to rise and fall. Having risen, they're destroyed. They're passing truest bliss. So there's a lot of magical things going on at the end of the Buddha's life. This sort of water becoming clear, the Buddha's skin becomes very bright, the flowers falling in worship, all these devas arising, the earthquake. So it's saying something about this is a very significant event. It's like there's a charged atmosphere, and all the unenlightened disciples are understandably grief-struck. Says, and those who had not overcome their passions wept and tore their hair, raising their arms, throwing themselves down and twisting and turning, crying, all too soon the blessed Lord has passed away. All too soon the welfarer has passed away. All too soon the eye of the world has disappeared. And apparently all the animals also wept, apart from the cat. The cat, Bante's take on this is the cat being an independent being. But those who were enlightened just remained mindful. And Anuruddha, who is enlightened, said, friends, enough of your weeping and wailing. Has the Lord not already told you that all things that are pleasant and delightful are changeable, subject to separation and becoming other? So why all this, friends? Whatever is born, become, compounded is subject to decay. It cannot be that it does not decay. The Devas, friends, are grumbling. They seem to be doing quite a bit of grumbling, but maybe they wanted that silence around the death. And even today, if you go to Kusinara, you can still, I think, feel something of the atmosphere. I haven't been very recently, but I have been there on pilgrimage, and there is something. It's almost like the air tremors there. It's like this very solemn, beautiful peacefulness, and I think. Well, in a way, you get a touch of that. In a way, with any death, obviously, there's a very significant one, the Buddha's death, and I think within that there may be not, just grief, but other responses. I remember when my mother died in May 2020, which was just at the beginning of the first lockdown. By this time, she'd declined in a way that she. Sadly no longer recognised me. I realised she no longer recognised me when I went to see her one day, and she said to me, kiss me. So I gave her a little kiss, and then she said, kiss me again. I gave her a little kiss, and then she said, who are you? And I thought, yeah, I'm just mother, I'm just a random man. But anyway, so it was the start of lockdown, and so I led the funeral. We only were given, unfortunately, 10 minutes in the crematorium, and it was just myself and my sister, because we couldn't have them. We were on separate, I only remember all the social isolation, and with that we had a picnic lunch afterwards where we socially distanced, my sister and I. But afterwards, straight afterwards, so I'm from North Yorkshire, and my mother died up there, and I went walking in the moorland, and I felt tremendous joy. Partly there was something about the release of my mother from suffering. She'd been bedbound for 6 years, which was, not a pleasant way of living. But also, in that moment, I was more receptive to beauty, more receptive to life, and revisiting childhood haunts in a very beautiful part of the world. just filled me with joy. So I think if we contemplate death, if we contemplate the Buddha's Parinirvana, it can help us in a very positive way become more fully aware of impermanence. Of course it's a commonplace that everything is impermanent, but we very easily behave as things go on forever. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of, for example, getting ill and somehow feeling it's a mistake, or when you're held up in traffic, or when your computer you've got a glitch in your computer and it slows down or stops working, that somehow it can feel like it's a mistake, like this should not be happening. And even get upset about it or angry. If we notice that happening, it's a sign that we don't really believe in impermanence. We think that things should just go the way we want them to go. And when we reflect on impermanence, and often, particularly in terms of death, we often think of endings, of losing. So when we recall death, it can be helpful because it can remind us that we don't have time to waste. Particularly remembering our own death, we can remember we don't have time to waste. And of course, again, a truism, but with friends, with dear ones, with anyone, we don't know if this meeting will be the last. So in a way, it invites us to, as it says in the Dhammapada, compose our quarrels and make the most of each moment. But impermanence can also, when we think about it, we can think in terms of beginnings or things arising, things coming into being. Clearly, if there was no impermanence, there would be no possibility for spiritual development. So it's good to just notice what our tendency is. So when we reflect on impermanence, do we tend to become a bit gloomy and despondent, a bit nihilistic, or are we more on the optimistic side of things? I remember years ago I was leading a big beginners retreat, and I decided we'd have in the middle of the retreat a silent day on impermanence. So I had different people reading various sort of readings, poems, including one of, do you remember, Ambapali, the courtesan turned nun. So at the end of her life, she gave this, in a way, song of liberation, which is a reflection on impermanence, on the changes in her body. For example, it starts with, "Once my hair was black like the colour of bees, alive, curly. Now it is dry like bark fibres of hemp. I'm getting old. This is true. I tell you the truth. Covered with flowers, my head was fragrant as a perfumed box. But now, because of old age, it smells like dog's fur. Thick like a grove it used to be, beautiful, ends parted by comb and pin. Now it's thin. I'm telling the truth." And it goes on and on and on about her body and how her body is decaying. I could feel in the mood in the room. It went down and down. I was sitting there, "Oh, this is great, lovely, enjoying it," but in the mood, the mood in the mood was not so good. So we have to be careful when we reflect on impermanence and notice what our tendencies are so that we can use it in a helpful way. Of course, ultimately, what impermanence is pointing to is there are no fixed things, so there's no endings or ceasings, because there's no thing to end or cease, to arise or cease. So impermanence, when we meditated on it deeply, is pointing to something, if you like, beyond impermanence. And it's perhaps this is why perhaps Saka says that when the Buddha dies, impermanent are compounded things, prone to rise and fall, having risen they're destroyed, they're passing truest bliss. So maybe this is what Saka is pointing to. And maybe we can sometimes get a glimpse of that. I referring to the joy I felt after my mother's death as maybe something pointing to something of this. So I think when we do this, we're more deeply in touch with reality. We can't always do that, but we can reflect on impermanence. And the way Bhante says about Buddhism is it's not pessimistic, it's not optimistic, it's melioristic. Melioristic means things can get better. And, for example, today we've got, I believe, 6 people becoming mitras. So hopefully that will mark change in their lives, in your lives. I imagine some of you are here. Hopefully to give you happier, more fulfilling lives. And here, we've got a new centre, which is a really great opportunity. There's already much more activities happening here in Brixton, and I believe more to come, which I think somebody's going to say something like that presently. So we can put our energy into supporting things that can help both ourselves and help other people, and in this context help the growth and the creation of the Sangha here. Now, probably after a space, turning into the Brixton Buddhist Centre is not going to lead to complete world peace. But anyway, as I've already said, that's not our primary aim. But if we do that, if we engage in this way, if we remember the Buddha's Parinirvana, if we remember impermanence, we can remember that there's real possibility, real potential for transforming our own minds, liberating our own minds, and offering a very positive alternative for the world.